Kuba sat quietly beneath the shade of a baobab tree at the edge of her village, her back resting against the rough bark. The once vibrant colors of her traditional attire had faded, much like the hope that had once filled her heart. Her dark skin, marred by the pox-like lesions from a viral outbreak, now appeared even more sunken against her slender frame. Kuba had always been proud of her long neck, adorned with brass rings that had been a part of her cultural heritage since she was a child. But now, those rings felt heavier as her body grew weaker each day. Malnutrition had spread through the village like a shadow, making even the simplest of tasks feel like a struggle. The rains had not come this season, leaving the crops withered and the rivers dry. Food had become scarce, and the elders' attempts to trade with nearby villages had yielded little. She gazed out over the sun-drenched landscape where a few children played, their laughter a faint echo against the stillness. Yet, even their joy was tinged with weariness. Her stomach rumbled, a dull, familiar ache, but she had learned to ignore it, to bury the hunger beneath the thoughts of her people and their struggles. The setting sun painted the sky in a blaze of orange and red, the colors blending like a canvas, but all Kuba could think about was the waiting. Waiting for the rains, waiting for help, waiting for something to change. She watched as her younger brother, thin and fragile, walked toward her with a small bowl of porridge. He handed it to her with a hopeful smile, though his eyes revealed his own exhaustion. She took it with a grateful nod, knowing that he had probably given up his share for her. As she ate the meager portion, she thought about her mother's stories, tales of plentiful harvests and joyous celebrations when the village thrived. Those days felt like a distant dream, lost amidst the dry season and the relentless grip of disease. She tried to find comfort in those memories, but reality tugged at her like the wind pulling at her headscarf. Kuba's thoughts drifted back to the village elders, who spoke of aid from distant cities, of doctors and food supplies that would come to help. But each day, without a sign of their arrival, made hope harder to hold on to. She prayed silently to the spirits her mother had taught her to honor, asking for strength to see another day, for a miracle that would bring rain to their parched land and health to their struggling bodies. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, the air cooled, bringing a small comfort. Kuba wrapped her thin arms around her knees, her mind filled with unanswered questions. How long would they have to endure? Would the aid ever come? She closed her eyes and listened to the distant hum of the night insects, trying to find peace in their song, even as the weight of hunger and uncertainty pressed upon her. In that moment, she resolved to keep waiting, for herself, for her brother, and for her people. Because as long as she was alive, there was still a chance that the sunrise might bring change, or that a new day might carry with it the promise of relief. As darkness settled over the village, Kuba found herself staring up at the night sky, the stars scattered like tiny diamonds across an endless canvas. They twinkled with a distant light, untouched by the struggles of those below. Kuba liked to think that the stars held secrets, whispers of hope that traveled across time and space to reach her. But tonight, their light felt cold and far away. Her brother Chuma settled beside her, resting his head against her shoulder. His breath was shallow, the sound fragile in the still night air. She could feel his ribs pressing against her arm, a stark reminder of how little they had eaten. Even so, he spoke softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Kuba, "Do you think the doctors will come tomorrow?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the darkness met the earth. She wished she could lie to him, to promise that help was just over the next hill. But her heart was too tired for false hope. Instead, she wrapped an arm around him, pulling him closer. "I don't know, Chuma, but we will be here, waiting, together." He nodded, accepting her words with the quiet resilience of a child who had grown up too fast. They sat like that for a while, listening to the distant calls of nocturnal animals, the village around them silent save for the occasional cough from a nearby hut. Each sound, each breath seemed amplified in the stillness, as if the night itself was listening to their fears. The next morning arrived, bringing with it the harsh light of another day. Kuba rose early, even though her body ached with the effort. The village came to life in its own subdued way, the elders gathering near the well, their faces creased with worry. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices heavy with the burden of making impossible decisions. Who would get food today? Who might need to wait another day? Kuba had overheard their conversations before, and she knew they were running out of options. She joined the line of women and children at the well, waiting for her turn to collect water. The well, once a source of life, now offered only a trickle, barely enough to fill the small clay jar she carried. As she bent down to draw water, she heard the crunch of footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw a group of strangers approaching the village, their silhouettes framed by the rising sun. Kuba's heart leapt into her throat. They wore uniforms, different from anything she had seen before, and carried bags and boxes stamped with unfamiliar symbols. She recognized the look of relief in the eyes of the elders, their shoulders sagging as they realized what this meant. The aid they had prayed for was finally here. The strangers, aid workers, set up a makeshift station at the center of the village, distributing food rations and medical supplies. Kuba felt a strange mix of hope and fear as she watched them work. She waited in line with Chuma, clutching his hand tightly. When it was their turn, a woman with kind eyes knelt down to speak with them. "What are your names?" she asked gently, her voice accented but clear. "Kuba, and this is my brother, Chuma," she replied, her voice barely more than a murmur. The woman smiled softly and handed them a small sack of food, rice, beans, and a packet of powdered milk. It felt like a treasure in Kuba's hands. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of weeks of uncertainty. The woman reached out, brushing her hand over Chuma's forehead and frowning slightly at his thin frame. "We'll have a doctor check on you soon," she said, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Kuba recognized. It was the look of someone who knew they were fighting a battle they might not win. As the aid workers moved on to help others, Kuba led Chuma back to their hut. They cooked a small portion of the rice, savoring every bite. For the first time in what felt like forever, the ache in their stomachs eased. The taste of the warm food brought a smile to Chuma's lips, and seeing him smile brought tears to Kuba's eyes. She quickly wiped them away, not wanting him to see. But the relief, however small, was only temporary. As the days passed, it became clear that the aid would not be enough to fully turn the tide. The supplies they brought were like a bandage on a wound that needed stitches. There was still no cure for the viral infection that had marked Kuba's skin, no promise of rains that would revive the fields. Yet the presence of the aid workers gave the villagers a sense of solidarity, a reminder that they were not entirely alone in their struggle. Kuba spent her days helping the aid workers, translating for them when she could, learning about the medicines they distributed, and watching as they treated the worst cases in the village. She had always been curious, always eager to learn, and in the midst of her exhaustion, she found a new purpose. If she couldn't change everything, she could at least make a small difference. One evening, after a long day of work, she sat beside Chuma under the baobab tree once more. The sky was darkening, but this time it didn't feel so heavy. The stars twinkled above them, and she found herself sharing stories with Chuma. Stories of faraway places she had heard from the aid workers. She told him about bustling cities where water flowed freely and food grew in abundance. Maybe one day we'll see those places, she said, more to herself than to Chuma. He looked up at her with wide eyes, his face still thin but hopeful. Do you think we will? Kuba smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in weeks. She didn't know if it was true, but in that moment she believed it was worth hoping for. Maybe, she said softly, and as the night wrapped around them, she held on to that hope, small and fragile, like a seed waiting for the rain.